A mighty civilization vanished without leaving a single weapon behind. This is the profound mystery of the Indus Valley civilization. Archaeologist Jane McIntosh noted that the Indus people seem to have been uniquely peaceful in a violent world. Yet around 1900 BCE, this sophisticated society, with its grid-like cities and advanced sanitation, simply faded away. Why would a culture of such scale and ingenuity disappear without any trace of warfare, conflict, or conquest? By the end of this exploration, you will understand how a perfect storm of silent forces reshaped an entire world. We will uncover why rivers changed their course, how trade networks fell silent, and what happens when a society chooses dispersal over battle. What does it mean for peace to be both a civilization's greatest achievement and its potential undoing? Across a sprawling landscape larger than many modern nations, a society was taking shape. For nearly 2,000 years, the Indus Valley civilization thrived, a contemporary and equal to the kingdoms of Egypt and the city-states of Mesopotamia. Its heartland was the fertile basin created by the Indus River and the now-vanished Gagga-Hakra River system, a cradle of innovation that gave rise to cities of astonishing foresight. What they built there was not just a collection of towns but a unified cultural sphere, a civilization that stretched over 1 million square kilometers. To grasp the scale of its vanishing, we must first appreciate the height of its existence. These were master planners. Their cities, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were laid out in precise grids with baked brick houses, sophisticated drainage systems, and communal baths that speak to a deep concern for public welfare. They developed a system of standardized weights and measures, tiny cubes of chert stone so consistent that merchants from Mesopotamia to the Indus could trust a transaction without speaking the same language. Their artistry was minute and magnificent, carving intricate scenes of animals and mythic figures onto small stone seals, and crafting beads of carnelian so fine they were treasured across the ancient world. This was a connected society, its trade networks reaching far across land and sea. Yet for all its visible achievements, something profound is missing from the archaeological record. Unlike the pyramids that shout of pharaohs or the palaces that proclaim kings, the Indus cities present a puzzle. Archaeologist Gregory Possehl described a sense of functional anonymity. There are no towering statues of rulers, no grand temples or opulent royal tombs screaming for attention. The cities seem designed for efficient, communal living rather than the glorification of a single power. This very character, this lack of a central, flashy authority, makes the civilization's end even more mysterious. How do you explain the collapse of something so vast, so organized, and seemingly so peaceful? What kind of force does not leave a mark of battle, but still manages to dissolve a world? Digging through the layers of Mohenjo-Daro, an archaeologist uncovers the foundations of a home, the careful slope of a drainage channel, the remains of a bead maker's workshop. The soil yields pottery, tools, children's toys, but it does not yield swords. It does not yield spears designed for battle, or shattered armor, or the grim iconography of conquest. This absence is as loud as any discovery. In a world where ancient history is so often written in bronze and blood, the Indus Valley civilization presents a profound silence. The evidence for their peacefulness is not found in a single dramatic artifact, but in a pervasive pattern of what is missing. Scholar Jonathan Mark Kenoyer has long noted that while they had sharp tools for cutting and small points likely used for hunting, the cities show no dedicated weapons of war. Their art tells the same story. The famous seals depict animals, mythical creatures, and ritual scenes, but never a king trampling an enemy, never a battle, never a bound prisoner. Their city walls, once thought to be for defense, are now seen by many researchers as flood barriers or symbols of civic identity. They built granaries and public baths, not fortified citadels bristling with armaments. Compare this to their contemporaries. In Mesopotamia, royal inscriptions boasted of smiting foes, and kings were buried with arsenals. In Egypt, pharaohs were depicted as mighty warriors, and temple walls celebrated military triumphs. For the Indus people, the prestige objects were not weapons but standardized weights, exquisite beads, and beautifully carved seals, tools of commerce and culture. This negative evidence, this lack, is a powerful archaeological clue. It suggests a social fabric woven differently, one where authority might have been distributed among merchants, priests, and planners, rather than concentrated in the hands of a warrior elite. Their power seems to have flowed from control of resources and ritual, not from the threat of violence. This pervasive peace is the first monumental clue in our mystery. It forces us to ask a new kind of question. If an army did not topple them, what did? When the greatest threat to a society is not an external enemy, where do you look for the source of its unraveling? The answer may lie not in the clash of armies, but in the quiet, relentless shifts of the earth itself. A researcher turns a small stone seal over in their hands, its surface cool and smooth. Etched into it is a line of elegant, stylized symbols, a script that has guarded its secrets for over 4,000 years. This is the silent script of the Indus Valley, a writing system found on thousands of seals, pottery shards, and copper plates, yet one that remains completely undeciphered. It is history's most profound unanswered letter. While we can read the boastful proclamations of Egyptian pharaohs and the meticulous accounting tablets of Mesopotamian merchants, the voice of the Indus people is locked behind a linguistic door for which we have no key. This isn't merely a missing page, it is an entire unwritten book of their politics, their beliefs, and their daily struggles. Linguist Asko Parpola, who has dedicated decades to the puzzle, notes the core problem is the lack of a Rosetta Stone, a bilingual text that could bridge the gap between their symbols and a known language. Without it, the script, which appears to be logo-syllabic using a mix of word signs and sounds, offers only tantalizing glimpses. We see it, but we cannot hear it. This silence forces archaeologists into a unique form of historical detective work. They must reconstruct an entire civilization using only the language of objects, the grammar of bricks and beads. We can infer a great deal from their meticulously planned cities and standardized weights, evidence of remarkable social coordination. But what we cannot see are the tensions that leave no physical trace. Could there have been disagreements between merchants and priests, or disputes over resource allocation, that simmered beneath the surface of this orderly society? Did a shift in religious belief or a challenge to traditional authority create a kind of social fracture invisible to us today? In other cultures, such internal conflicts are often shouted from steles and chronicles. Here they are whispers lost to the wind. This profound linguistic void amplifies the mystery of their disappearance. If they faced a crisis, did they debate it in council? Did they record prophecies of change or lamentations of loss? We will never know their own explanation. This silence pushes our investigation away from the realm of kings and battles, and toward the quieter, yet immensely powerful, detectives of climate and earth. When a society leaves no written testimony, we must listen instead to the testimony of the soil, the trees, and the rivers themselves. The lifeblood of this civilization was not just the great rivers, but the reliable rhythm of the sky. Every year, the summer monsoon winds would sweep in from the Indian Ocean, carrying torrential rains that fed the Indus and its sister rivers, replenishing the fields that fed millions. This was a society built on a promise of water, a mighty tree whose roots drank from a predictable cycle. Then the rains began to fail. This is where our investigation turns from the silent artifacts to the silent testimony of the earth itself. written not in script but in mud, stone, and ancient ice. Paleoclimatologists, the detectives of past climates, have uncovered a startling story. By studying ocean sediment cores from the Arabian Sea, the layers of lake beds, and the slow drip that forms stalagmites in caves, they can read the history of the monsoon like a long-forgotten diary. These natural archives reveal a prolonged and devastating trend. Beginning around 4,200 years ago, the summer monsoon began a centuries-long weakening. The data shows a significant drop in rainfall, a shift that would have fundamentally reshaped the landscape. Researcher Liviu Giosan and his team pieced together this puzzle, focusing on the now dry Gaga-Hakra river system, once a major artery of the civilization. Their work suggests that as the monsoons weakened, the rivers that sprang from them shrank. The great Gaga-Hakra, likely the legendary Sarasvati River of later texts, transformed from a perennial flow into a seasonal stream, and then into a series of shallow pools before vanishing into the desert sands. This was not a sudden, apocalyptic drought. It was a slow-burning crisis, a gradual tightening of a vital resource over generations. For farmers, it meant declining harvests. Year after year, the same amount of sown seed would have yielded less grain. For the cities, it meant strained granaries and the slow erosion of the agricultural surplus that supported their artisans, traders, and planners. The civilization found itself caught in a vise of its own success, its large population now facing a shrinking resource base. The environmental pressure was immense and inescapable, a silent, pervasive stress that would test the very foundations of their peaceful, coordinated society. How does a culture engineered for stability respond when the ground beneath it, quite literally, begins to dry up and shift? The answer may lie in the choices they made next, not as a unified empire, but as countless communities searching for a way forward. A mighty river can become a memory. The Gaga-Hakra, a watercourse so significant it was later remembered in sacred texts as the Sarasvati River, began to fade. Its once reliable flow, the very reason cities rose along its banks, dwindled to a seasonal trickle and then to dust. This was not a simple drought but a fundamental rewiring of the landscape, a slow-motion disaster written in shifting silt and dry riverbeds. Two immense forces conspired to starve these waterways. The first was the failing monsoon, which robbed the rivers of their annual replenishment. The second was the restless earth itself. Tectonic activity, the slow grinding of continental plates, subtly altered the lay of the land. Some geologists suggest this gentle tilting of the plain may have pushed the waters of the Gaga-Hakra toward the neighboring Indus system, while other channels simply sank into the ground, their water finding new, deeper paths away from the waiting fields. The civilization was an expert in water management, but it was engineered for a specific reality. Their meticulously planned cities, with their wells and reservoirs and baths, were monuments to controlling a predictable resource. When the rivers themselves began to move and shrink, that entire system was thrown into crisis. Archaeologist R.S. Bisht, who studied sites like Kalibangan in detail, points to the physical evidence of this struggle. At Kalibangan, researchers found signs of increasing salinity in the soil and a desperate reliance on deeper, more labor-intensive wells as the surface water vanished. This was a community fighting a losing battle against the desert. The consequences rippled through every aspect of life. Agriculture, the foundation of their surplus, became precarious. Trade routes that followed river valleys became longer, more difficult, and less profitable. The urban water supply, once a marvel of engineering, became a constant, draining concern. Here was a peaceful, highly organized society facing its greatest challenge not from an enemy army, but from the retreat of its own lifeblood. Their response to this existential pressure reveals a civilization choosing adaptation over conflict, a decision that would ultimately lead not to a battlefield, but to a quiet, widespread dispersal. The farmer stood at the edge of his field, the baked earth cracking under his feet. For generations, his family had worked this land, relying on the intricate network of canals and the predictable flood of the river. Now the sun beat down with a new kind of intensity, and the water in the irrigation ditch was a shallow, muddy trickle. The wheat stalks, once tall and golden, were stunted and pale. This was not a single bad season. It was a new and unsettling reality. The agricultural genius that fed millions was being undone by the very climate that had made it possible. The civilization's foundation was not stone or brick, but grain. Their prosperity was built on a surplus of wheat and barley, large-grained cereals that thrived in the fertile, well-watered soils of the river valleys. This surplus allowed people to specialize. It supported the potter, the beadmaker, the trader, and the city planner. It was the economic engine of urban life. As the monsoons weakened and the rivers shrank, that engine began to sputter. Archaeobotanists, scientists who study ancient plant remains, see this crisis written in seeds and pollen. At sites across the Indus region, the layers of soil tell a story of adaptation and desperation. Over time, the evidence shows a significant shift. The preferred crops of wheat and barley, which require reliable water, become less common. In their place, people began cultivating more drought-resistant millets and pulses. These were hardy survivors, able to grow with less rainfall, but they came at a cost. Millets are generally less productive and yield a smaller nutritional return per acre than wheat. Think of it as a society, once dining on hearty loaves of bread, now having to make do with a thinner, simpler porridge just to get by. This dietary shift is more than a change in menu. It is a stark indicator of systemic strain. A reduced agricultural surplus creates a chain reaction of scarcity. There is less grain to store in the public granaries, less to trade for precious materials like lapis lazuli or copper, and ultimately, less to support the dense population of the cities. Subtle signs of nutritional stress appear in some skeletal remains from the later periods, suggesting periods of hardship. Furthermore, in a drying landscape, the very act of irrigation could turn against the farmer. Without sufficient river flow to flush the soil, repeated watering in a hot climate draws salt to the surface, a process called salinization. This slowly poisons the land, making it infertile. A field that once fed a family for generations could become a barren, white-crusted patch within a lifetime. This was a slow, silent pressure with no villain to fight, no fortress to storm. The true conflict was not on a battlefield, but in the diminishing yield of each harvest. As the economic and dietary pressures mounted, the centrifugal forces pulling people away from the struggling cities grew stronger. Why remain in an urban center when its granaries are emptying and its water is scarce? The failure of the field set the stage for a profound societal reorganization, a quiet exodus in search of greener pastures or at least reliable water. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro, once a symphony of commerce and daily life, began to fall silent. This was not a sudden evacuation, but a gradual quieting, a slow trickle of families packing their belongings over generations and walking away. The archaeological record reveals this urban exodus not through dramatic destruction, but through subtle, telling changes in the very fabric of the cities. As you walk through the excavated ruins today, the evidence of decline is etched into the bricks and the soil. Archaeologists note a distinct shift in construction quality in the uppermost layers. New walls are built with carelessly made, uneven bricks, sometimes even recycled from older, crumbling structures. The famous Great Bath, a center of ritual and community, shows signs of neglect. Drains become clogged and are not repaired. Public spaces, once meticulously maintained, begin to accumulate domestic refuse, as if the shared sense of civic order was slowly unraveling. At the site of Harappa, researchers found later period houses being subdivided into smaller, cramped units, a possible sign of economic strain and changing social structures. The most telling evidence, however, comes from the broader landscape. While the great cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were slowly depopulating, something else was happening in the hinterlands. Smaller, rural settlements began to proliferate in new areas, particularly to the east and south, towards the watershed of the Ganges River system. This is a crucial clue. It shows a massive migration of people, but not a chaotic flight. They were moving toward regions where monsoon rains were still reliable, or where smaller, more manageable river systems could support a different kind of life. The civilization was not being erased, it was transforming. The grand, centralized urban experiment was being traded for a more dispersed, flexible, and sustainable way of living. This was a strategic retreat, a resilient adaptation by a people who chose to change their way of life rather than fight over the dwindling resources of their ancestral homes. Their power had always come from coordination and trade, and now that coordination turned toward a managed dispersal. But as the cities emptied and the population spread out, the intricate threads that held this vast cultural tapestry together began to fray. One of the most vital threads, the one that connected them to the wider world, was starting to snap. The great trade routes fell silent. For centuries, these overland paths and sea lanes had been the civilization's lifeblood, a network of exchange that stretched from the shores of the Arabian Sea to the great cities of Mesopotamia. Indus merchants traded their finely drilled carnelian beads, their distinctive square seals, and their sturdy cotton cloth for Mesopotamian copper, tin, and luxury goods. This was more than commerce, it was a system of shared identity and purpose that bound the far-flung cities together. Archaeologist Shireen Ratnagar notes that this long-distance trade was not just an economic activity, it was a social glue, reinforcing the authority of a coordinating class that managed production and maintained standards. The civilization thrived as a central hub in a vast, interconnected world. Then, the connections began to break, as environmental stress choked agricultural surplus and strained urban centers. The capacity for large-scale, specialized production waned. The workshops that once mass-produced identical beads and seals for export slowed their output. The evidence for this economic unraveling is clear and quiet. In the layers of soil dating to the civilization's later phases, archaeologists find fewer of the tiny, perfectly standardized chert weights that once guaranteed fair trade from one city to the next. Their disappearance suggests a breakdown in the formal, regulated exchange system that required such precision. Even more telling is the view from afar. In the meticulous records of Mesopotamia after around 1900 BC, the mentions of Meluhha, the ancient name for the Indus region, grow scarce. The distinctive square Indus seals, once prized and used in Mesopotamian trade, stop appearing entirely in foreign ports. The world had stopped calling because the Indus had stopped answering. This was a silent economic collapse. Without the surplus goods to trade, and with the urban centers that coordinated this trade losing their population, the long-distance networks that brought in vital resources and prestige items simply withered. The loss was profound. It meant not just a shortage of imported metals, but a loss of the shared economic project that gave the civilization its cohesive, pan-regional character. When the trade that defines you disappears, what holds you together? The answer for the Indus people appears to have been less and less. The centralized authority, which may have derived its influence from managing this complex economy, found its reason for being evaporating. There were no vast storehouses of centralized wealth left to plunder, no single capital whose fall would mean victory. The power and the purpose had already dissipated, carried away by the same slow exodus that emptied the cities. This economic unraveling helps explain the profound absence of warfare. Why fight a war over ruins when the real value, the people and their skills, have already moved on? The final act of this civilization was not a battle, but a quiet fragmentation into smaller, resilient regional cultures, a story written not in conquest, but in changing pottery styles and local traditions. The pottery tells a story of change, not of erasure. In the layers of soil left by the people who moved eastward, away from the drying Indus Valley, archaeologists do not find a sudden break in tradition. Instead, they find a slow evolution. The sturdy, wheel-made pottery of the great cities, often painted with black geometric designs on a red background, begins to show new influences. Motifs shift, forms adapt, but the fundamental knowledge of how to shape and fire clay continues unbroken. This is the quiet evidence of cultural survival. The grand narrative of a civilization vanishing is challenged by these everyday objects. What we are witnessing is not a collapse, but a profound transformation, a strategic shift in how and where people lived. As populations migrated toward the Ganges Basin and other regions with more reliable rainfall, they carried their world with them in the form of skills, beliefs, and technologies. The urban experiment of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa may have ended, but the people who built it did not disappear. In the smaller, post-urban communities that flourished centuries later, known to archaeologists as Chalcolithic or Copper Age cultures, the legacy of the Indus is unmistakable. Bead making, that signature Indus craft, persisted. The knowledge of how to drill long, perfect holes through hard carnelian stone resurfaced in new centers. Techniques for making faience, a glazed ceramic material, were passed down. Even certain ritual practices, suggested by the continued use of figurines and specific symbolic motifs, seem to echo earlier traditions. This reframes the entire mystery. The story becomes one of resilience and adaptation. Faced with an environmental crisis that made their concentrated urban model unsustainable, the Indus people made a collective choice for dispersal. They traded the grandeur of the city for the security of the village, exchanging a complex, centralized system for a more flexible, localized way of life. Their culture did not die, it decentralized. It blended with the practices of other groups and evolved to meet new challenges, gradually weaving itself into the broader tapestry of South Asian history. This perspective is crucial because it explains the absence of warfare in the archaeological record. There was no conquest to fight because the people themselves were the ones moving. There was no centralized power to overthrow because that power had already dissolved, its authority rendered obsolete by changing circumstances. The end of the Indus Valley civilization as a unified entity was not a violent event, but a long-term, peaceful reconfiguration of society. This brings us to the final, lingering question. If the urban ideal was abandoned, what new ideal took its place? What kind of world emerged from this great dispersal? And how did the memory of that once mighty, peaceful civilization shape the cultures that followed? For over a century, a single story dominated the explanation for the Indus Valley's end. It was a narrative of conquest, of light-skinned, horse-riding warriors from the north, the Aryans, sweeping down and overwhelming the peaceful cities. This theory, born in a colonial era, proposed a dramatic clash of civilizations, a violent break that explained the disappearance of one culture and the rise of another. It seemed to fit a pattern familiar from other parts of the ancient world. Yet, as archaeologists dug deeper, this compelling story began to crumble under the weight of actual evidence. The first and most glaring problem is the complete absence of the smoking gun. If a massive invasion or military conquest had occurred around 1900 BCE, the layers of soil at Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and other major sites would be a chaotic archive of that violence. Archaeologists would expect to find clear signs of sudden, widespread destruction, burned structures, weapons of a new type concentrated in destruction layers, and perhaps even unburied remains from a final conflict. None of this materializes. The archaeological record shows gradual abandonment and decay, not catastrophic ruin. the timeline itself is a mismatch. The urban decline of the Indus cities was a process spanning centuries, beginning well before the proposed arrival of these nomadic groups into the region. By the time significant migration likely occurred, many of the great cities were already shadows of their former selves, their populations dispersed. You cannot conquer a ghost town. Furthermore, the material culture does not show a sharp replacement. Instead, it reveals a long, slow process of integration and synthesis. Later Vedic texts, once interpreted as chronicles of a war against dark-skinned natives, are now read by many scholars through a different lens. The conflicts described could reflect internal rivalries between tribes, or perhaps tensions with the post-urban communities descended from the Indus people themselves, not a war of extermination. Archaeologist Jim Schaffer succinctly summarized the modern view, stating that the archaeological record indicates not a military overthrow, but a complex cultural continuity and change. What emerges is a picture of interaction, not annihilation. Migrating groups likely encountered a landscape already transformed, populated by smaller, resilient communities carrying forward Indus technologies and traditions. Over generations, languages, beliefs, and social structures blended, giving rise to the new cultural synthesis of the subcontinent. Dismantling this invasion theory is not just an academic exercise, it is essential to solving our core mystery. It removes the last traditional suspect, the expected warrior, from the scene. With no evidence of a catastrophic external enemy, our investigation is forced back to the quiet, powerful forces we have already traced, the environmental shifts and the remarkable social choices they triggered. This leaves us with one final, profound question about the nature of this civilization's legacy. If their end was not a violent break, but a transformative dispersal, what lasting imprint did this uniquely peaceful, coordinated society leave on the world that followed? The streets were clean, the bricks were identical, and power was invisible. This is the social puzzle at the heart of the Indus Valley. Without palaces or royal tombs, where did authority reside? Scholars looking at this blank space have proposed a fascinating possibility: a society governed by a peaceful hierarchy, perhaps a council of elders, a guild of influential merchants, or a class of ritual specialists. Imagine a city run not by a single king with an army, but by a board of directors concerned with weights, measures, and the proper flow of water. This corporate model, as some call it, would explain the remarkable uniformity. Standardized bricks and weights across a vast region suggest a powerful coordinating authority, but one focused on commerce and civic function rather than personal glorification. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro could have been a center for ritual purification overseen by a priestly class, its maintenance a shared civic duty that reinforced social cohesion. Others suggest a network of competing elite groups, merchants from one city, landowners from another, who maintained a balance of power through intricate trade agreements and shared religious practices. In this view, the civilization was held together by a web of mutual interest, a delicate equilibrium where cooperation was more valuable than conquest. This social structure was a masterpiece of stability in a time of plenty. It fostered innovation, managed complex logistics, and maintained that profound peace we see in the archaeological record. But every strength has its corresponding weakness. A system engineered for consensus and balance may struggle with swift, decisive action. When the slow-moving crisis of drought and river shift began, a king with absolute power could, in theory, command massive labor to redirect canals or ration supplies from a central storehouse. A council of merchants or priests, however, might debate, deliberate, and seek compromise while the water tables fell. The very decentralization that made them resilient in normal times could have hampered a unified, large-scale response to an environmental emergency. Different cities or elite factions might have pursued their own survival strategies, prioritizing their local community over the collective good of the civilization. The system was designed for maintenance, not for emergency mobilization. This peaceful hierarchy, a source of their strength for centuries, may have become a kind of fatal rigidity when unprecedented flexibility was demanded. The collapse, then, was not a dramatic explosion but an administrative unraveling. The centrifugal forces of local survival simply pulled the web apart, thread by thread, as each group made the rational choice to disperse toward resources, leaving the grand urban experiment behind. This social model completes our picture of a vanishing without warfare. It shows how a society can choose to quietly dissolve when its central organizing principle, whether a river or a shared commercial project, ceases to function. The very sanitation that defined their cities may have become a source of unseen peril. Those advanced drainage systems and public baths of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were marvels of their age, designed to manage water and promote cleanliness in a dense urban environment. But this intricate relationship with water held a hidden vulnerability. When the rivers that fed their wells grew sluggish and the monsoon rains grew unreliable, the delicate balance of public health was thrown into chaos. Stagnant water in depleted canals and reservoirs could become a breeding ground for mosquitoes, while contaminated drinking sources could spread illness with terrifying speed. This introduces a silent, biological dimension to our mystery, a pressure that leaves its mark not on city walls but on the bones of the people themselves. Paleopathologists, scientists who study ancient disease, turn to skeletal remains to read this hidden history. Their work reveals subtle but telling clues about the hardships of the civilization's later centuries. Examinations of bones from some sites show signs consistent with periods of nutritional stress where the body lacked essential resources. Evidence of anemia, often linked to iron deficiency or parasitic infections, appears in certain populations. While finding direct proof of a specific epidemic 4,000 years ago is incredibly difficult, the conditions for one were becoming ripe. Imagine a densely populated city, its once flawless water management now compromised, its resources stretched thin. In such an environment, waterborne illnesses like dysentery or cholera could spread rapidly. Crowded living conditions might facilitate other communicable diseases. This is the silent killer theory, not of a dramatic plague, but of a gradual erosion of communal vitality. A population grappling with unreliable food, compromised water, and increased illness is a population under immense strain. Its energy is sapped, its morale diminished, and its capacity for the complex work of maintaining a civilization is drained. This biological pressure would have made urban life increasingly unattractive and unsustainable. It adds a profound human dimension to the environmental crisis. It wasn't just that the rivers were drying up, it was that the quality of life in the cities they supported was deteriorating in a very personal, physical way. When a place becomes associated with sickness and scarcity, the decision to leave is not just economic. It is a deeply human instinct for survival. The search for cleaner water and more abundant food becomes a powerful driver of dispersal, accelerating the quiet exodus from the grand urban centers. This layer of stress completes a devastating triad: environmental, economic, and now biological, all converging without a single enemy in sight. It forces us to ask what remains of a culture when its people scatter, carrying with them not just their tools, but their memories and their very identity. Their technological mastery was a monument to consistency. For centuries, the people of the Indus Valley produced bricks of a perfect, standardized ratio, pottery of elegant and predictable form, and tools that met every need of their orderly world. Yet in this very perfection, some scholars see a potential vulnerability. What if a civilization becomes so adept at solving the problems of its golden age that it loses the capacity to solve new ones? This is the puzzle of technological stasis. Their toolkit was brilliant, but it shows a remarkable continuity over hundreds of years. The pottery styles evolved slowly. the bronze tools remained functionally identical, and their architectural signature, the baked brick and the grid layout, saw no revolutionary shift. They perfected the brick, but there is no evidence they ever developed the true arch, a structure that would allow for wider, stronger spans in building. This wasn't a society ignorant of technology, far from it. It was a society supremely confident in the technology it had. This long continuity suggests a deep cultural satisfaction. Their solutions for sanitation, for standardized trade, for urban planning, worked so impeccably for so long that there may have been little perceived need for radical change. Innovation often flourishes under pressure, whether from competition, scarcity, or conflict. The constant arms races and territorial rivalries of Mesopotamia and Egypt, for instance, drove rapid advances in metallurgy, fortification, and military engineering. The Indus world, by contrast, seems to have lacked that kind of intense external competitive pressure. Without the threat of invasion, where was the urgent need to build higher walls, forge sharper swords, or design new siege engines? Their peace, a defining achievement, may have removed a powerful catalyst for technological leaps. When the unprecedented environmental crisis arrived, this conservatism could have become a critical weakness. Faced with rivers that were disappearing, they had the knowledge to dig deeper wells, but perhaps not the imperative to develop entirely new, large-scale water capture technologies like the sophisticated Qanat systems seen later in Persia. Confronted with declining agricultural yields, they shifted to hardier crops, but the existing toolkit may have been insufficient to dramatically intensify production on the poorer soils they were now forced to cultivate. The existing paradigm, brilliant for maintaining a stable system, was not designed for radically transforming a failing one. This isn't a judgment of failure, but an observation about the nature of innovation. A society's technology is a dialogue with its environment. For centuries, the Indus dialogue was one of elegant control. When the environment began speaking a new, harsher language, one of drought and scarcity, the old vocabulary of bricks, standardized weights, and efficient drains may have simply run out of words. The systemic challenges demanded adaptive, perhaps even disruptive, new tools, and those tools never emerged in time. This technological stasis completes a portrait of a civilization that was supremely well adapted to its specific world, but whose very adaptations made it less flexible when that world changed beyond recognition. It underscores a profound truth about collapse. Sometimes the greatest threat is not an enemy at the gate, but an inability to reinvent the tools within. A ritual without water is a promise broken. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, that vast brick-lined tank at the heart of the city, was more than an engineering marvel. It was a profound symbol, a place where the community's relationship with the divine and with itself was physically enacted. Water was not just a resource for them, it was a sacred medium, essential for purity, order, and perhaps for the very favor of the gods. As the monsoons failed and the water table sank, maintaining this center of ritual would have become a struggle, then an impossibility. The bath would have slowly emptied, its bricks cracking in the sun, a silent, monumental testament to a broken covenant. This spiritual dimension is the final, crucial layer of the collapse. The civilization's cohesion relied not just on trade and planning, but on a shared world of belief. We glimpse this world in their artifacts, most famously on the small stone seals. One seal in particular shows a figure seated in a yogic posture, surrounded by animals, an image some scholars cautiously link to a prototype of the later Hindu deity Shiva. Others show what appear to be ritual scenes, perhaps involving a sacred tree or a bull. These are not random decorations. They are clues to a complex ideology that validated the social order. The elites who coordinated city life, whether priests or a council of elders, likely derived their authority from administering these rituals, from being the intermediaries between the people and the forces that controlled the rains and the rivers. Their power was spiritual as much as it was practical. Then the rains did not come, the rivers shrank. For years, then decades, then generations, the prayers and the offerings seemed to have no effect. Imagine the growing disillusionment. If the rituals performed at the Great Bath no longer ensured a bountiful harvest, what was their purpose? If the symbols on the seals, the proto-Shiva or the sacred bull, could not bring back the life-giving waters, were they still powerful? This is a crisis of faith, a slow eroding of the ideological glue that holds a society together. When the gods appear to have abandoned you, you may begin to question the human authorities who claim to speak for them. The elites presiding over the declining cities would have faced a devastating loss of legitimacy. Their entire reason for being, their claim to coordinate labor and resources, was built on a promise of maintaining cosmic and social order. As that order visibly unraveled in the fields and the drying riverbeds, their authority would have crumbled. This spiritual disillusionment is a non-violent but immensely powerful force for fragmentation. It does not require an invasion, it works from within. People do not just leave a city because the granaries are low, they leave because the story that made the city meaningful has stopped making sense. The collective purpose that once brought thousands together to build and maintain something magnificent simply evaporates. Why remain loyal to a system, to a place whose gods have fallen silent? This loss of shared belief made the dispersal not just a practical necessity, but an ideological release. It allowed communities to walk away without feeling they were betraying something sacred, because the sacred connection to that place had already been severed by the unrelenting drought. The civilization did not end with a bang of battle, but with the quiet whisper of a prayer that finally no one believed worth saying anymore. History is filled with the echoes of falling cities. To truly understand the quiet of the Indus Valley, we must listen to the louder collapses that came before and after. The ancient world offers other stories of sophisticated societies that unraveled, and in their endings we find a hauntingly familiar refrain. Take the Akkadian Empire of Mesopotamia, the world's first true empire, which crumbled around 4,200 years ago, a time frame eerily close to the Indus decline. Cores drilled from the Gulf of Oman contain layers of wind-blown dust from that period, pointing to a catastrophic drought so severe it was remembered for millennia. The empire's central authority, dependent on taxing grain from the north to feed cities in the south, shattered when the rains failed. Here, climate stress triggered social unrest, rebellion, and invasion, a cascade of violence etched into records of cities sacked and kings overthrown. Centuries later, the classic Maya of Central America faced a similar pattern. Decades of intense drought in the 9th century, revealed in sediment cores from lake beds, strained their agricultural systems to the breaking point. Competition for dwindling resources escalated into chronic warfare between city-states, captured in stone monuments boasting of captured kings. The social contract, already stretched by the demands of supporting elite classes and monumental construction, snapped under the pressure. In both these cases and in many others, the final act of collapse featured conflict. Environmental crisis exposed and amplified existing social fractures, leading to a violent struggle for what remained. This makes the Indus Valley an extraordinary outlier. It experienced the same core stressors, a shifting climate and failing water sources, yet the archaeological record holds no evidence of that final, violent unraveling. There is no last stand, no sacked city, no iconography of a triumphant enemy. Why? The answer may lie in the very nature of their social complexity. Scholar Joseph Tainter proposed that societies invest in increasingly complex solutions to problems, building administrative layers, monumental projects, and specialized roles. For a time, this complexity pays off, creating stability and surplus. But eventually, a point is reached where the cost of maintaining that complex system, the energy required to run the bureaucracy, build the monuments, and support the elites begins to outweigh the benefits it returns. This is the point of diminishing returns. For the Indus people, their magnificent urban infrastructure, the grid plans, the massive brick platforms, the sophisticated drainage, represented a huge investment in complexity. It was a system that delivered incredible order and public health for centuries. But when the environmental crisis hit, the cost of maintaining that system skyrocketed. Keeping the baths filled and the drains clear with a dwindling water supply would have required ever more labor for diminishing reward. Repairing city walls against floods that no longer came was an effort with no return. In Tainter's framework, the most rational response for a society hitting this wall is to simplify, to downsize. And that is precisely what the archaeological evidence suggests the Indus people did on a civilization-wide scale. They chose decentralization over conflict, dispersal over defense. They walked away from the costly urban experiment and reformed into smaller, less complex, and more sustainable village-based communities. This comparative view casts their disappearance in a new and revealing light. Their peacefulness was not a passive weakness, but an active social strategy that persisted even in decline. While others fought over the crumbling pieces of a complex system, the Indus people simply stopped investing in the system itself. They prioritized the survival of their communities over the preservation of their cities, a final, profound expression of a social contract that had always valued collective stability over the glory of conquest. What then, after the Great Dispersal, became of the world they left behind? The cities were gone, but the people remained. Across the vast plains of the Indian subcontinent, a new cultural landscape emerged after 1900 BCE, a vibrant mosaic of regional traditions where once there had been a unified urban tapestry. This was the post-Harappan world, a time not of darkness but of profound and necessary reinvention. The grand, standardized vision of the Indus, with its identical bricks and weights, dissolved into a spectrum of local expressions. In the north, around what had been Harappa, a culture known to archaeologists as Cemetery H developed, named for its distinctive burial practices. Their pottery was boldly painted with new motifs, birds and sun symbols replacing the older geometric patterns, suggesting a shift in both artistic taste and perhaps spiritual beliefs. Further east, along the now seasonal river valleys, communities using what is called ochre-colored pottery established small villages, their material culture showing a clear blend of older Indus traditions and new innovations. Meanwhile, in Gujarat and other regions, late Harappan communities persisted for centuries, holding onto elements of their ancestral way of life while adapting to a more mobile, pastoral existence. This regional diversity is the clearest archaeological evidence of the Great Dispersal. Without the centralizing pull of the metropolis, local groups were free to develop their own styles of pottery, their own approaches to honoring their ancestors, and their own adaptations to specific micro-environments. A pot made in a village in the Punjab no longer needed to look exactly like one made in Sindh, because they were no longer part of the same tightly managed economic network. This shift from uniformity to variety tells a story of resilience, not ruin. The socio-economic order had fundamentally changed. The complex, resource-intensive urban model was replaced by a simpler, more flexible rural and pastoral one. Communities became smaller and more self-sufficient, their fortunes tied to local conditions rather than a fragile, continent-spanning system. This way of life was arguably more resilient to the ongoing climatic variability. If one valley suffered a dry spell, a community could move their herds or shift their cultivation more easily than a massive city could relocate its population. The civilization's legacy did not vanish, it simply went to seed. Scattered practices and technologies carried by the dispersing populations took root in new soil. The knowledge of bead drilling, of working with copper, and certain ceramic techniques resurfaced in these regional cultures. Some symbolic motifs, like the recurring reverence for the bull or the pipal tree, seem to echo from the Indus seals into later artistic traditions. This period of fragmentation was the ultimate peaceful adaptation. It was a society consciously, or out of sheer necessity, choosing mobility and decentralization over a doomed, last-ditch defense of its empty urban cores. There were no walls to make a final stand upon because the people had already voted with their feet, carrying the essence of their culture with them into a future that valued survival over stone. This quiet transformation laid the very groundwork for the cultural ferment that would follow, a slow blending of traditions that set the stage for the next great chapters in the history of the subcontinent. To understand the full meaning of their disappearance, we must finally confront the most persistent myth of all, a story of conquest that has shaped historical imagination for over a century. Are we looking for evidence of war in the wrong way? This question forces us to step back and examine not just the Indus Valley, but the very tools archaeologists used to see conflict in the past. Our entire investigation rests on a profound absence, a lack of the traditional markers we associate with societal collapse. But what if our methods are tuned to hear only one kind of violence? The standard archaeological toolkit for identifying warfare is powerful, but it has its blind spots. It looks for the unmistakable, the catastrophic. It scans skeletal remains for the clear signs of traumatic injury, for blade marks on bone or the distinctive fracture of a skull from a club. It catalogs specialized weaponry, objects designed with no other purpose than to harm another person. It maps fortifications, looking for walls built not to hold back water, but to hold back armies. In the Indus context, these tools come up empty, yet this very emptiness invites a deeper, more challenging line of inquiry. Could conflict have taken forms that are archaeologically invisible? Consider the power of social ostracism, of cutting a family or a guild off from trade networks or ritual participation. Imagine economic sabotage, the subtle redirecting of water or the hoarding of standardized weights to disrupt fair exchange. These are acts of social friction that can destabilize a community without leaving a single weapon or broken bone behind. They are a cold conflict fought with rules and influence rather than blades. Furthermore, what we might interpret as a peaceful society could, in another light, be a society so effective at controlling internal strife that it never escalates to physical, record-leaving violence. A highly regulated, consensus-based system might resolve disputes through mediation, arbitration, or ritual long before they reach the point of a lethal clash. This is low-level, non-lethal conflict, a constant hum of negotiation and social pressure that maintains order but leaves no direct mark on the material record for us to find 4,000 years later. This methodological debate does not undermine the consensus for the Indus Valley's unusual peacefulness. Instead, it refines and strengthens it. It asks us to be precise about what we mean by peace. It was likely not a utopian absence of disagreement, but rather a remarkable cultural success in managing disagreement through non-violent means. Their peace was an active achievement, a social technology as sophisticated as their drainage systems. By engaging in this reflexive analysis, we guard against a simple error, mistaking the absence of evidence for evidence of absence. We acknowledge the limits of what bones and bricks can tell us about the full spectrum of human tension. Yet even when we account for these invisible forms of conflict, the conclusion holds. The scale and coordination of this civilization and its eventual dispersal still point away from the kind of systemic, catastrophic warfare that defines the end of so many other ancient societies. The silence in the ground remains a meaningful silence, one that speaks volumes about a different kind of social contract. Having scrutinized our own methods, we can look with greater confidence at the world that emerged from the Great Dispersal, searching not for a broken society, but for the enduring seeds it planted. Their mastery of water was a quiet kind of genius. At Dhalavera, a city on a low island in the salt flats of Gujarat, you can still walk among the ruins of one of the ancient world's most sophisticated water management systems. They did not just rely on a river, they engineered a complete hydrological landscape. A series of massive, stone-lined reservoirs were carved into the city's very bedrock, fed by a network of channels that captured every drop of monsoon rain and diverted seasonal streams. These were not simple ponds, they were precisely calculated storage units designed to see the community through the long, dry months. This was the pinnacle of their relationship with water, a relationship of absolute control. For centuries, this engineering created stability and allowed cities to flourish in otherwise challenging environments. It was a monumental achievement, a victory of order over nature's unpredictability. Yet within this very success lay a hidden vulnerability. The more complex a system becomes, the more energy it demands just to keep it from falling apart. This is a concept from physics called entropy, the natural tendency of ordered systems to move toward disorder. In human terms, it means that a complex city, with its intricate drains, reservoirs, and public baths, doesn't maintain itself. It requires a constant, organized input of labor, coordination, and social will. The baked brick linings of a reservoir must be repaired after every season. The channels feeding it must be cleared of silt. The social authority to marshal that labor must remain unquestioned. For generations, this was a worthwhile investment because the system delivered life-giving water, public health, and civic pride. But what happens when the environment changes and the return on that massive investment begins to shrink? As the monsoons weakened and the overall water supply diminished, the cost of maintaining this hydraulic marvel began to skyrocket. Imagine the laborers who once spent a season maintaining the reservoirs that would be full for years. Now they might spend the same amount of effort, only to see those reservoirs fill to a fraction of their capacity or evaporate faster in the hotter, drier air. The energy output, the social effort, was yielding less and less water. The system was experiencing its own form of entropy, a slow slide into dysfunction where the cost of upkeep finally outweighed the benefit. This is collapse viewed as a pure systems failure. The brilliant solution, the network of wells and reservoirs that enabled urban life, gradually transformed into a liability. It was a technological trap. The society had become so specialized, so perfectly adapted to managing a specific hydrological reality, that it lacked the flexibility to pivot when that reality vanished. They were experts at storing and channeling water, but the new challenge was a fundamental lack of water to store. Maintaining the empty, cracking reservoirs of Dhalavera would have been a ritual of futility, a drain on a community's dwindling energy. So they made the rational choice. They stopped investing in the complex system. They did not fight a war over the last reservoir because controlling a failing system offered no prize worth the conflict. Instead, they walked away from the high-maintenance urban model, choosing a simpler relationship with water elsewhere, in places where a single well or a small spring could sustain a village without an army of engineers. Their defeat was not by an enemy, but by the relentless, escalating mathematics of diminishing returns. The very intelligence that built their world ultimately prescribed its peaceful abandonment. Every city has a limit, a mathematical boundary defined by the land that feeds it. This is the concept of carrying capacity, the maximum population an environment can support indefinitely. For centuries, the Indus Valley thrived within this balance. The fertile floodplains, nourished by reliable rivers and monsoons, produced enough surplus grain to feed not just farmers, but the artisans, traders, and planners who built the cities. The carrying capacity was high and the population grew, filling those grid-like streets and orderly neighborhoods. But when the environment changes, that crucial number plummets. The land's ability to support life is not a fixed promise. It is a dynamic equation, and the variables were shifting. Researchers now use sophisticated demographic models, essentially computer simulations of ancient populations, to understand this pressure. By inputting data on climate, agricultural yields, and settlement sizes, these models can recreate the invisible stresses that build within a society. What they reveal is a story of a population hitting a wall. As the monsoons weakened and harvests declined, the carrying capacity of the Indus heartland contracted. The cities, however, were already full. Think of a room designed to comfortably hold 50 people. Now imagine the air supply slowly being reduced while the number of people remains the same. Tension builds not from malice, but from the simple, inescapable arithmetic of scarcity. The archaeological settlement data maps this crisis. The large urban centers show signs of reaching their peak density, just as the environmental signals turned negative. Their hinterlands, the agricultural zones that surrounded and supplied them, could no longer produce the necessary surplus. A city like Mohenjo-Daro was a magnificent engine, but it required a vast amount of fuel in the form of food, water, and labor. When the fuel supply dwindled, the engine began to stall. This created powerful push factors for migration. People were not necessarily being pulled by the allure of new lands in the east. They were being gently, inexorably pushed from the old ones by the reality of hunger and thirst. The dispersal was a demographic response, a rebalancing of population against a new, lower carrying capacity. Computer models that simulate these dynamics show a pattern of gradual movement, not a single, panicked exodus. Community by community, family by family, people made the rational calculation to leave the straining urban centers for places where the equation of survival added up more favorably. This demographic lens transforms our view of the collapse entirely. It was not a death of a people, but a redistribution of them across a wider canvas. The civilization did not vanish. Its population density simply changed, thinning out across the landscape like water seeking its new level. This movement was a peaceful, collective adaptation. There was no need for warfare over resources in the dying cities because the most valuable resource, the people themselves, were already voting with their feet, carrying their skills and traditions toward a future that could sustain them. The silent exodus was in fact a profound act of societal intelligence, a quiet agreement to change the pattern of life rather than fight over the fading remnants of the old one. A king in Mesopotamia built a ziggurat to touch the heavens. A pharaoh in Egypt commissioned a pyramid to defy time itself. These are the loud, permanent signatures of concentrated power, statements meant to echo through eternity. In the Indus Valley, the rulers, if we can even call them that, built something profoundly different. They built sewers, they built public baths and standardized weights. The most monumental structures we find are not tombs or temples, but elevated platforms that likely served as foundations for granaries or civic centers. This architectural silence is deafening. There are no colossal statues proclaiming a ruler's glory, no opulent palaces walled off from the common people, no treasure-laden burial chambers designed for a single individual's afterlife. The cities themselves were the monument, and they were a monument to collective welfare. This tells us something revolutionary about how power worked here. Authority was not centralized in a god-king who commanded armies and claimed divine right. Instead, it appears to have been diffused, perhaps held by a council of elders, a guild of influential merchants, or a class of ritual specialists who managed the complex logistics of city life. Their power was based on control of things like trade networks, standardized measures, and the ritual cycles that maintained social harmony, not on the control of land through military force. Think of it as the difference between a CEO who controls a company's stock and a board of directors that manages its operations. One is a singular, towering figure, the other is a collaborative, functional body. This diffused power structure was brilliantly effective for maintaining a stable, prosperous society. It invested the surplus wealth of the civilization back into the community itself, into clean water and fair markets, rather than into the aggrandizement of a single ruler. It fostered that remarkable peace because there was no single throne worth fighting a bloody war to claim, but this very system contained a hidden fragility. When a pharaoh died, the pyramid was already built, the institution of kingship remained, and a successor would fight to fill the vacuum. The system was designed for succession, even violent succession. In the Indus system, authority was likely based on continuous economic prosperity and the ideological consent of the population. The merchants held sway because the trade flowed. The priests held sway because the rituals brought rain. The planners held sway because the cities functioned. This was a power sustained by results, not by stone monuments. So, what happened when the results began to fail? When the trade dried up and the rains did not come, the very foundation of that diffused authority evaporated. There was no palace to storm, no royal lineage to overthrow, because the power was not housed in a place or a person. It was woven into the functioning of the system itself. When the system broke down, the authority simply dissolved. Without a centralized state to defend or attack, there was nothing to trigger a violent struggle for succession. The people did not rebel against a king. They simply walked away from a bargain that was no longer working. The missing monuments, therefore, are not an absence of power, but a clue to a completely different kind of power, one that was so integrated into daily life that it became invisible, and when the conditions that sustained it changed, it vanished without a trace, leaving behind not ruins of conflict, but the quiet, empty streets of a model that had reached its logical end. The true measure of a civilization may not be in the stones it leaves behind, but in the seeds it scatters. As the great Indus cities quieted, a profound cultural diffusion began, not through conquest or decree, but through the quiet, persistent movement of people. The beadmaker who packed his drills and migrated eastward carried more than just tools. He carried a legacy of precision and artistry that would take root in new soil. This is how a civilization vanishes without truly disappearing. Its spirit survives not in monuments, but in the subtle threads woven into the fabric of future cultures across the Indian subcontinent. We can trace these threads in the material record, a quiet continuity beneath the surface of dramatic change. The exquisite craftsmanship of Harappan carnelian beads, with their impossibly long, fine drills, finds echoes in later bead-making centers for centuries. The knowledge of working with copper and producing faience, a glazed ceramic, did not vanish but resurfaced in new regional traditions. Even the humble pottery, while changing in style, maintained a technical lineage, a silent hand down of skill from one generation of artisans to the next, long after the original urban context was forgotten. These are not grand declarations of inheritance, but the quiet, practical persistence of knowledge passed from parent to child, from master to apprentice, across the great dispersal. The legacy was carried in muscle memory and in the shared understanding of how the world could be shaped by human hands. This transmission of technology was the most tangible form of cultural survival, ensuring that the intelligence of the Indus people did not perish, but simply found new workshops and new patrons. Yet the influence ran deeper than craft alone, touching the very realm of ideas and spiritual practice. Some of the most intriguing continuities lie in the symbolic world. The famous seal depicting a figure seated in a meditative posture, surrounded by animals, has long sparked scholarly curiosity. While we must be cautious not to overinterpret, this image undeniably suggests a conceptual precursor to later yogic and ascetic traditions that became central to Indian spirituality. The idea of a powerful, disciplined figure attaining a state of peace or mastery, represented in that iconic posture, seems to resonate across millennia. Similarly, the recurring reverence for certain animals like the bull and plants like the pipal tree on Indus seals finds clear parallels in later iconography and religious thought across the subcontinent. Perhaps the most profound conceptual continuity is the sacred significance of water. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro stands as a monumental testament to ritual bathing, a practice that would become a cornerstone of piety in later Hindu tradition. The idea of purification through contact with ritually managed water, of a communal space dedicated to spiritual and physical cleansing, appears to be a powerful concept that survived the cities themselves. This suggests that the dispersing populations carried with them not just pots and tools, but a worldview, a set of symbolic understandings about humanity's relationship with nature and the divine. This cultural and genetic tapestry was woven slowly over generations as migrating Harappan communities interacted with other groups. Modern genetic studies of populations in the region reveal a complex, layered ancestry with a deep substrate dating back to the Indus Valley civilization. This scientific evidence confirms what the archaeology implies: the people did not vanish, they blended. They became part of the genetic and cultural bedrock of South Asia, contributing to the incredible diversity that would follow. Their legacy, therefore, is not one of a fallen empire to be mourned, but of a foundational layer in a constantly evolving cultural landscape. The civilization did not end with a bang, but with a long, quiet exhalation that spread its essence across a continent. This reframes the entire narrative of disappearance. It was not an erasure, but a metamorphosis. The torch was not dropped, it was peacefully passed from the hands of urban planners to those of village elders, from seal carvers to storytellers, ensuring that the spirit of that uniquely peaceful, coordinated society lived on in new and unexpected forms far from its original riverbanks. Their story feels strangely familiar, a whisper from 4,000 years ago that speaks directly to our modern anxieties. We live in an age of our own profound environmental stress, where shifting climate patterns and concerns over water scarcity shape headlines and futures. The Indus Valley civilization presents us with a deeply unsettling yet peaceful prototype of collapse. They were not destroyed by an external enemy, but by the slow, relentless erosion of their ecological foundation. Their most remarkable achievement, maintaining a vast, coordinated society without internal warfare, may have also been a critical factor in their quiet dissolution. This forces a difficult, reflective question upon us. In the face of an existential, systemic threat like climate change, is a society's internal peace a sign of resilient strength, or could it mask a dangerous form of vulnerability? The Harappans demonstrate that a culture can be extraordinarily successful at managing human conflict, yet remain tragically unequipped to manage conflict with its changing environment. Their social contract was built for stability, not for rapid, disruptive adaptation. They perfected the art of living together, but when the world around them demanded a fundamental reinvention of how to live, their consensus-based systems may have fostered debate instead of decisive action. Consider our own global situation. We possess technologies the Harappans could never have dreamed of, satellites that monitor drought and models that predict sea level rise. Yet we too are often locked in complex, slow-moving debates about how to respond, balancing immediate economic needs against long-term planetary health. Our social and political systems, for all their sophistication, can show a similar inertia, a reluctance to make the profound collective shifts required by the scale of the challenge. The Indus people did not see their crisis coming in a scientific sense, but they felt its effects for generations. We see ours with crystal clarity, projected in graphs and data sets, yet the gap between knowledge and transformative action remains. Could a highly complex, interconnected modern society also experience a non-violent unraveling, not through war or invasion, but through 1,000 incremental failures, supply chain disruptions from extreme weather, economic strain from resource depletion, and the gradual migration of populations from becoming less habitable regions? Their dispersal was a rational adaptation to local drought. Our potential displacements would be on a continental scale. This is where their story holds its most potent lesson. Resilience is not just about building stronger walls or more powerful armies. It is about building more flexible, adaptive social structures. The Harappans ultimately found resilience not in defending their cities, but in leaving them, in fragmenting into smaller, more sustainable units. For us, the equivalent is not abandonment but transformation, redesigning our energy, agricultural, and economic systems to be regenerative rather than extractive. Their legacy asks us to look beyond the immediate specter of conflict and consider a quieter, more insidious danger, the danger of becoming so perfectly adapted to a world that is disappearing that we fail to create the new one demanded of us. The silent streets of Mohenjo-Daro are not just a mystery to be solved, they are a mirror. They reflect a future we must work diligently to avoid by learning the most crucial lesson their piece bequeaths, that survival sometimes requires the courage to let go of what was and build something new. The story of the Indus Valley is not a single line of cause and effect, but a vast, intricate tapestry. Its threads are the failing monsoon, the wandering rivers, the silent trade routes, the peaceful social order, and the quiet hardships of its people. Pull on any one thread in isolation and the fabric might have held, but woven together, they created a pattern of stress no society could sustain indefinitely. This is the essence of a multi-causal collapse, where environmental, economic, and social pressures intersect and amplify one another in a devastating feedback loop. The drought reduced the harvest, which strained the cities and crippled long-distance trade. The broken trade networks undermined the economic authority that held the civilization together, while the declining urban conditions challenged public health and spiritual beliefs. Each weakness compounded the next, creating a slow-motion cascade. The civilization's defining peacefulness was the crucial filter through which all these pressures were processed. A society organized for consensus and commerce, without a warrior elite or a cult of monumental kingship, faced this perfect storm with a fundamentally different set of instincts. There was no central throne to fight over, no stored royal treasure to loot, and no glorified tradition of martial last stands. When the system began to fail, the most rational, culturally consistent response was not to fortify and fight, but to simplify and disperse. They chose exit over escalation, transformation over conflict. This explains the profound archaeological silence where we expect the noise of battle. Their unique social character did not cause the environmental crisis, but it absolutely defined the nature of their response to it. The end was not a dramatic explosion, but a gradual dimming, as communities made countless individual decisions to seek equilibrium elsewhere, carrying the seeds of their culture with them. The Indus Valley civilization succumbed to a convergence of crises, but in doing so, it demonstrated a form of resilience we are only beginning to understand, one measured not in monuments left standing, but in a people's capacity to walk peacefully away from a world that could no longer support their dream. 4,000 years later, the silence is still the loudest part of their story. We are left with the central paradox of a mighty civilization that simply walked off the stage of history, leaving behind no drumbeat of war, no epic of conquest, no last stand etched in stone. The overwhelming evidence points to a profound peace, a social fabric woven without the thread of organized violence. Their cities were marvels of coordination, not fortification. Their art celebrated nature and ritual, not triumph over enemies. This was not a society hiding from conflict, but one that seems to have built a different kind of order. The compelling case for their disappearance leads us not to an invading army, but to a shifting sky and a wandering earth. A centuries-long weakening of the monsoons, the lifeblood of their rivers, slowly starved the agricultural surplus that supported urban life. The very rivers that gave them life, like the Gaga Hakra, changed course or sank into the sands, turning fertile plains into challenging landscapes. Faced with this slow-moving existential pressure, the Indus people made a monumental societal choice. They chose to disperse and adapt. They traded the grand urban experiment for a more flexible, sustainable existence in smaller communities elsewhere. This was not a defeat, but a strategic retreat, a peaceful reconfiguration of life in the face of an unbeatable, impersonal force. In this light, their greatest strength, that remarkable social cohesion and apparent peace, may have fundamentally shaped the nature of their decline. A society organized for consensus and commerce, without a warrior elite or a cult of glorious kings, lacked the instinct for a final, violent struggle over the crumbling pieces. Their power was diffuse, based on functioning systems, and when those systems failed, the authority simply dissolved. There was no central throne to fight for, only a collective agreement to seek a new equilibrium. The legacy of the Indus Valley civilization, as archaeologist Rita Wright reminds us, is one of planned cities and social harmony. It stands as a quiet testament to human ingenuity that challenges our deepest assumptions, the idea that conflict and conquest are the inevitable engines of history. They built a world that thrived without them, and when that world changed, they left without a fight, their story a haunting and powerful alternative to the familiar tales of collapse. What do you think this peaceful enigma says about the paths a society can take? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys into history's greatest mysteries.